A British cruiser glides through the North Sea, its hull a riot of jagged stripes that would make a zebra blush. The sudden burst of color is not a work of art but a desperate gamble against a new kind of death that lurked beneath the waves. It is 1917, and the Great War has turned the ocean into a hunting ground where torpedoes strike faster than a man can reload a gun. The Royal Navy, once confident that sheer size could outmatch any threat, now watches its own battleships become easy targets for unseen submarines. In the cramped war rooms of Portsmouth, a handful of engineers and artists argue over a question that will reshape naval tactics: could chaos on a ship's skin confuse the eye of a periscope? The story begins with the German U-boat campaign, which by the middle of the conflict had already taken a heavy toll on Allied merchant shipping. Submarines prowled the Atlantic, their periscopes rising just enough to glimpse a silhouette against the horizon. At that distance, a ship's outline was all a commander could rely on to decide whether to fire. The British Admiralty, alarmed by the mounting losses, commissioned a series of experiments to break the visual link between target and torpedo. The answer came not from a new weapon but from a new illusion. First beat, the birth of Dazzle. In early 1917, a Royal Naval Staff officer named Norman Wilkinson, a marine painter by trade, presented a radical proposal to the Admiralty. He argued that instead of trying to hide a ship, a task impossible for a vessel the size of a battleship, navies should paint them with bold, contrasting patterns that would distort their true size, speed, and heading. The concept was simple: if a periscope could not accurately gauge a ship's course, the torpedo would likely miss. Wilkinson's sketches showed ships covered in sweeping black and white bands, angular blocks, and zigzagging lines. The Admiralty, desperate for any edge, gave the idea a provisional green light. Second beat, the first trials. The first real-world test took place later that year on a carrier that had been converted for experimental work, HMS Furious. Workers in the shipyard applied a series of geometric patterns using oil-based paints that could survive the salty spray. When the ship steamed out for sea trials, the crew reported that the patterns made the vessel appear to wobble and change direction as it moved. Observers on a nearby destroyer, tasked with estimating speed and bearing, recorded noticeable errors in their assessments, enough to suggest that a torpedo's straight-line trajectory could be compromised. The initial results were encouraging, prompting the Admiralty to expand the program. Third beat, the massive rollout and the human element. By the autumn of 1917, a dozen or more capital ships, battleships, battlecruisers, and armored cruisers had received Dazzle paint schemes. Each pattern was unique, designed by a small team of artists who consulted naval officers on the expected viewing angles. The crews, accustomed to the drab grays of peacetime, found the new skins both unsettling and oddly morale-boosting. Letters home from sailors speak of a ship that seemed to become a moving painting, a visual experience that made them feel part of something larger than the steel hull. German U-boat commanders, according to later reports, found the patterns confusing enough to make range-finding difficult, sometimes causing them to abandon an attack. Fourth beat, the turning point, scientific validation. Midway through 1918, the British set up a controlled experiment off the coast of Scapa Flow. Using a stationary target painted in plain grey and a second target painted in Wilkinson's Dazzle, they measured the accuracy of torpedoes fired from a submerged test submarine. The data showed a clear difference: torpedoes aimed at the plain target struck far more often than those aimed at the Dazzle-painted target. While exact percentages remain debated among historians, contemporary accounts suggest the success rate against the plain hull was markedly higher than against the patterned one. This evidence convinced even the most skeptical admirals that visual distortion was not merely an illusion but a measurable tactical advantage. The moment recontextualized naval strategy, the war was no longer only about firepower but also about perception. Fifth beat, the unintended consequences and the post-war legacy. As the armistice approached, the Admiralty ordered a final wave of Dazzle painting, this time on the newer classes of ships that would form the interwar fleet. However, the rapid application of thick oil paints added noticeable weight and increased maintenance demands. Some officers complained that the bright patterns made spotting by friendly forces harder in foggy conditions, leading to a few near collisions. After the war, the United States Navy experimented with its own versions of Dazzle, and the practice spread to other nations, persisting into World II in a more subdued form. Historians still debate whether Dazzle saved more ships than it cost in extra upkeep, but the visual legacy remains unmistakable. The final beat, the lingering mystery. Modern analysts using computer simulations have recreated the periscope view of Dazzle-painted ships, confirming that the patterns indeed break up the visual cues needed for accurate torpedo targeting. Yet some archival reports suggest that experienced U-boat commanders learned to read the patterns after a handful of engagements, reducing the advantage. The question that remains unanswered, and fuels debates in naval history forums, is whether Dazzle would have been effective against later sonar-guided weapons, or if its success was a brief, war-specific phenomenon. The answer lies somewhere between art and science, between a painted hull and a silent hunter beneath the waves. As the sun sets over the wrecked steel of the North Sea, the ghostly outlines of those striped giants drift beneath the surface, their colors faded but their story still vivid. The legacy of Dazzle camouflage reminds us that in war, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a cannon, but a trick of the eye that turns a battleship into a moving zebra, leaving future generations to wonder how many other battles have been won or lost by the simple act of painting a different picture.